Bible path in our study through the book of 2 Kings. We will get through chapters 15 and 16, and I'm going to leave chapter 17 as really kind of where we want to pick up next week all by itself. I don't want to try to incorporate it in with this because, as we'll see in the text today, the importance of what happens here is really kind of where we start to see the nation of Assyria begin to come into the ascendancy. And Hezekiah is going to be first mentioned by the time that we get to chapter 17. So this is a part of Israel's history that everything begins to change, Israel and Judah for that matter. So I want to leave that for itself. I want to take our time through that. 15 and 16 have plenty to offer to us as far as information and important matters. And so when we look at this, I want to really kind of emphasize the text really does a fine job of doing it anyway. It doesn't really need much of my help, but it'll show how bad things had become, and it really gives you an understanding of the desperate situation, not only for the nation in the north in particular with Israel. It becomes just like all the other pagan nations, not just in the way that they had slid into all of the idolatry from the very beginning, but the kind of intrigues between the kings. They're just starting to kill one another off at this point. And so what we get is clearly never what God had ever intended for his people. This is just what shows you what happens rather through the generations, the slow decline once it makes its way into a nation, that it doesn't even resemble where it had begun. And so we have here in the history of Israel kind of the same thing that we really see going on in our world right now and in our nation in particular. For all of its faults, the further that you go back into the history, for the way that there was, the problems that we had in our own country with slavery and with a number of different things in the past, the one thing that we didn't have was in the same kind of way the absolute immorality that goes on. We don't have the same kind of top to bottom violence, and it's a different world that we live in currently than had been in times past. For all of its faults, again, I don't just make it seem like it was perfect ever at any time, but I don't think that you can point to a time in our history where things have been this horrible as far as just, again, the consideration of what it's like in our country. So what this just shows is kind of more of a problem with human nature. And the more that you reject any understanding of the person of God, the worse it becomes among the people. And so this is how it is in the north. We're going to see this is how it becomes in the south, and how absolutely wicked it gets in the south. We're used to this with the northern tribes, okay, with what is known as Israel. We hadn't seen this quite the same way down in Judah, but by the time that we get through chapter 16, we will have seen it. So let's pick up at chapter 15, and let's have a word of prayer, and we'll look at the text. Father, we thank you as we come to your word that we can open our hearts and minds to you, and you can reveal to us what we should know from the text. We know that you desire to grow us in our understanding of who you are and what you have done for us. We pray, God, that as we look through the history of Israel, that we would be able to take notice of the failures that they had, that we wouldn't repeat the same kinds of things. I don't think we'll ever, clearly, the church should never get anywhere remotely close to this kind of wickedness, and if it does, it is clearly not the church. But Father, we pray that you would help us to guard our hearts at all times and not allow the compromise that we see illustrated over and over at this point in history. So we thank you, we give you praise, and ask that you would open our eyes. And we ask it in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 15 begins this way. It says, "Now in the 27th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Azariah, the son of Amaziah, king of Judah, became king." And so we're also going to see him, also he's known as Uzziah. And so it's kind of interchangeable for this particular part. Hopefully you have had a chance to save the kings of Israel. I don't want to have to keep putting it up over and over again. Again, you can go online, and it's always good to be able to see what the overlap of the kings are, because that's how this history is presented. It's in the whatever year of the king in the south is when the king of the north began, and so that's kind of how you're able to keep the chronology correct. But remember, this is always overlapping one group over the other, whether it's Judah or Israel. That's how you know that you're in the same era of time. You base them upon who is the king in either one of the places, Judah or Israel. So with all that said, he was 16 years old when he became king. He reigned for 52 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jecoliah of Jerusalem, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. Now notice it's not that he did as David did. It is kind of a grading, if you will, of how he walked before God. It was good, it wasn't great, and it was filled with compromise, just as the others before him. Here's one of the things that we want to make sure we understand. When it comes to David, he's kind of the measure of them, and I've mentioned this a number of times before. Though on a personal side of things, this was a man who had trouble with his passions. We know that, the whole sin with Bathsheba and all the horrible things that ended up happening with that. But most importantly, he never got to the place where he had brought Israel to the place of idolatry. And so that's why he's measured as different from the most of the rest of these. Notice, because we see right here in verse 4, this is where it is said, except that the high places were not removed, and the people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So what that tells us is that by this time, they had fallen into the corruption of all of the pagan nations in which that inhabited the land that they were supposed to have driven out. Again, I know that this is well-worn territory. We know from Joshua that they were supposed to cleanse the land of these people. God wanted for them to be obedient to him, and in order to do that, they would have to expel the inhabitants of the land because of their wickedness. What God wanted to do, as he was passing judgment on the wickedness of the people in the land, he wanted his people to be the ones who would expel them, cleansing the land of that wickedness and not allowing it to infiltrate the children of Israel. That was the direction that God had given to them. It was not what they did, and now we see the results of it hundreds of years down the road. That's where we are in their history. So with that being said, he did all these things. You know, he was a good king, quote unquote, but he did not tear down the high places. So that is the problem that became not having things in their proper order, not doing in total obedience to the Lord. And we see this. I'll give you the reference for it as well. 2 Chronicles chapter 26 starts at verse 16. What 2 Kings doesn't tell us is what he did that created the problem. Then the Lord struck the king so that he was a leper until the day of his death, and so he dwelt in an isolated house. And Jotham the king's son was over the royal house, judging the people of the land. If you go and read the passage in Chronicles, you'll find that Uzziah went into the house of the Lord and tried to do things that only the priests were allowed to do. And when he goes in to do those things, interestingly enough, we find that there's a different thing that happens a little bit later in Israel's history, or Judah's history, I should say, and it just shows the downward progression and the downward slide. But this is kind of a new thing that we will see here with Uzziah. It said that he didn't do evil in the sight of the Lord. In fact, what do we just read? It says he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. So he wasn't in a place of absolute rebellion, but we have two problems here. Again, according to that 2 Chronicles passage, he tried to do things that were reserved only for the priests. And he didn't get rid of the places where people would go to make sacrifice and honor other gods in the land of Judah. So those were problems with compromise. And this, again, this whole era of history is one of compromise after compromise after compromise. This is one of the places and one of the reasons why I say personally that I think that the Old Testament is so very, very important for us to know, because it tells about two things: the nature of man and the nature of God. Even for those who are his people, that he has called to be his people, when compromise comes in, it will lead to all manner of wickedness, even to the point of apostasy and the rejection of God altogether. That happened in Israel. It happens in the church. Doesn't matter if people want to call themselves believers. Their actions will be an indication of what's going on with them in the personal spiritual sense. So with that said, the Lord struck the king so that he was a leper until the day of his death. And again, you can read that in 2 Chronicles 26, starting at verse 16. So the rest of the acts of Azariah, Uzziah, and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the king of Judah? So Azariah rested with his fathers. They buried him with his fathers in the city of David, and his son Jotham reigned in his place. So we're going to get, again, the back and forth, the overlapping of the kings. There's a succession of them here that happen pretty quickly. And mainly because one gets murdered, one gets run off, or basically, I shouldn't say even run off. There is a change even in the people, and the family line is cut off at this point, and you'll see where that was prophesied that it would take place. So in the 38th year of Azariah, the king of Judah, so notice that he's already passed, as it is shown there, but this goes back some 20 plus years, and this is what happened in the 38th year of Azariah, the king of Judah. Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam, reigned over Israel in Samaria 6 months. It only took him 6 months. Now remember again, this is not the Jeroboam that started the northern tribes of Israel. That is a long ways in their history backwards. That's why it's always referred to as the first king of Israel, is Jeroboam, son of Nebat. This is a different Jeroboam. So it tells us that in the 38th year again, that Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam, reigned over Israel in Samaria for 6 months, only 6 months. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, as his fathers had done, and he did not depart from the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin. So you see it's a different Jeroboam. Then Shallum, the son of Jabesh, conspired against him, and he struck and killed him in front of the people, and he reigned in his place. Let that sink in for just a moment. This is so important, because it's, by this time, the history of the northern tribes is just littered with horrible, horrible people. And so he's no different from that. But the idea that now you start to have kings killing off one another just for the sake of power, this was never the intention. Obviously, this is never what God would have wanted. He wouldn't have sanctioned it. There were times that they were so wicked that God wanted them expelled and actually put to death for their wickedness and for their rejection of God and the things that they were doing among the people. But in this case, now they're just killing one another off to gain power, which helps you to recognize that God just says, hands off. If this is what they're going to do, this is what they're going to do. Reject the Lord in every conceivable way for generations, and the idea that he would take a hands-off approach and that they would consume one another is exactly what we should expect. If as I believe, God does not make man do anything against his will, he will also then allow men to do the things that they do, and I don't think this is any exception whatsoever. I think it's pretty obvious that these men were just, again, because of their wickedness, God did not intervene, and they just begin to consume themselves. But we're going to see Assyria is now going to be seen as coming onto the scene and coming onto the ascendancy, which means that the days of Israel, the northern tribes, they are numbered now. So, now the rest of the acts of Zechariah, indeed, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Once again, I say this all the time, just in case this is the first time you've studied through any of these with us. The Chronicles are not the same ones that we're going to study next, of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's just a history book of the kings. So, this was the word of the Lord which he spoke to Jehu, saying that your sons will sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation. And so it was. So from in verse 12, that's taken from 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 30. And what that was, when Jehu did what he did, remember, God used him to execute judgment on the house of Ahab and Jezebel. And God said of him to Jehu, though he was not a godly man in any way, he did at least do what God wanted done with the house of Ahab and Jezebel. But we see that he was just a totally wicked guy. But God said, I'll let you have for 4 generations, you'll have the kingdom. Well, this is the end of that kingdom, just as it was prophesied. Now, Shallum, the son of Jabesh, became king in the 39th year of Uzziah, the king of Judah, and he reigned a full month in Samaria. Woohoo! Hooray for you, a full month. Well, what happened with him? For Menahem, the son of Gadi, went up from Tisra and came to Samaria, struck Shallum, the son of Jabesh, in Samaria, killed him, and he then reigned in his place. So Tisra, it would appear, from what we know, again, there's differences of opinion, is in the same general area. So from what we can find, to the kind of the north and the east from Shechem. And so, again, in the northern territory, this is in Israel, closer to the Jordan River, below Galilee. So that's kind of the general area, Jezreel Valley area, hills, Gilboa, and all that. So in that general area is what we're talking about. So the rest of the acts of Shallum and the conspiracy, which he led, indeed, they are written in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. We will get a chance to look at that. Little details. There's really next to nothing that we know of the conspiracy. So we'll save that for later. Verse 16. Now, then from Tisra, Menahem attacked Tifsa and all who were there in its territory, because they did not surrender. Therefore he attacked it, and all the women who were with child he ripped open. Goodness, this is just barbaric. Now, there is, it's controversial in that the name place of where this isn't told to us. Now, there is a name for this city known to history, but it's well into Syria, up by the Euphrates River in Syria. Would be well outside the territory of Israel, but because there is no such place in Israel, it's believed that perhaps they were really starting to try expansion into Syria that was apparently weakened by this time, and yet there was going to be other things taking place shortly thereafter, where Syria would be joining Israel to come against Judah, as we'll see in the next chapter. So anyway, this is one of those things. It's difficult for us because we just don't have an understanding absolutely of the name places and for sure what the political alliances would be. But if this is the case, and there seemed to be some attempt at expansion, then what we know is that what was happening there leads him away from there, and he's coming back into the area of Israel because, again, this killing of the kings brings him back into the area. So from Tisra, Menahem attacked, from Tisra, Menahem attacked Tifsa and all who were there, and ripped open, killed all of the women who were pregnant, and thus killed off the children as well, needless to say. In the 39th year of Amaziah, king of Judah, Menahem, the son of Gadi, became king over Israel, and he reigned for 10 years in Samaria. Of course, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the days of the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. And again, if I haven't said it at any time, when you look at the kings of Israel, from the time that Jeroboam started until the last of the kings before the Assyrians wiped them out, there was never a godly king in all of the generations in the north. So let that, again, another thing, let that sink in. These are the same tribes and the same people that were led into the land after Moses through Joshua. And so a pretty good time in the nation of Israel then goes into the time after he left, when there was no one really to take his place. When he died, they go through that up and down time through the king, or through the judges, and by the time that they come to the kings, Solomon, and then from Saul, then to David to Solomon, the split coming after in the north never ever got on track and was in idolatry and rebellion against God for the entirety of their history in the north. So really, really important. So he did all of these things, but look at verse 19. Now Pul, the king of Assyria, came against the land, and Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to strengthen the kingdom under his control. And Menahem exacted the money from Israel, from all the very wealthy, and from each man 50 shekels of silver to give to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria turned back and did not stay in the land. Big mistake, again, but the north, you would expect this. They should have had the Lord fighting their battles. Instead, what they end up doing is paying off what would be a terrorist, paying off what would be someone who was looking to do them harm. That doesn't keep them from coming back. In fact, if anything, it emboldens them, and the next time that they may need something, start saber rattling and coming against Israel. And so what will you get? Give them, it'll be, if you don't give us money again, we're going to go after you. Man should learn this lesson, but of course they don't. So the rest of the acts of Menahem and all that he did, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And so he rested with his fathers, and Pekahiah his son reigned in his place. Now in the 15th year of Azariah the king of Judah, Pekahiah the son of Menahem became king over Israel in Samaria, reigned for 2 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, just like Jeroboam son of Nebat. So a continuation, of course, of the exact same things. Now notice what happens. Then Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the officer, an officer of his, conspired against him and killed him in Samaria, in the citadel, in the king's house, along with Argob and Ariah, and with their 50 men from Gilead. They killed him and reigned in his place. So we're starting to get into this. Not very long between, times when people usurp and rise up from within, kill the king off. Again, this is the stuff that you would see among the pagans. The idea that this is happening among the children of Israel. Let's remember, all of these people belonged to the tribes, the sons of Jacob. So all of those people that settled the land in the time of Joshua are now just finding ways to kill off one another and gain power to themselves. You'll find no better example of the condition spiritually and morally of a nation that one person will kill off another for the sheer effect of gaining power. But that's where they're at. That's where they are in their history, and that's how wicked things had become. So, in the days of Pekah, the king of Israel, let me just make sure. Yeah, okay. We find out at the end of verse 27 and 28 that he did evil in the sight. That's just kind of repeated all through this. It's almost like they all have that same bit of information given about them. But in the days of Pekah, the king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, came and took Ijon, Abel-Beth, Makkah, Genoa, Kadesh, Hazor, Gilead, and Galilee in the land of Naphtali, and he carried them captive to Assyria. Now this would be, from what we know, obviously we know where Galilee is, we know where Gilead is, we know where a few of those places are. The ones that are a little bit more unclear to us, though, it's a pretty good understanding that from Assyria, where they would have been in this area, would have come from the north and then came down through the northern part, through Lebanon, and then through Israel, and would have taken it from north as they're coming to the south. So if you've ever been there, if you've been to Israel, you would find how that would be easier to do. You have to pretty much clear the Golan Heights in the north and come a little bit to the west and then around the Golan Heights. Or if not, you're going to have to go quite a bit further to the south, clearing the Golan Heights to come into Israel, but then you have a big incline to come up 2,500 feet roughly to get up into the higher land. So it makes much more sense, as we would understand it, them coming from the east and then from east to west and then down through the north, and that would bring them into the area of the populations. But this would start like up in the area of Dan. But remember, by this time, Israel had expanded its borders into modern-day Lebanon. So that just helps to understand how far they had gone. But if Assyria is going to come from the north, they're going to start to wipe out the northern territories as they make their way down. That's what's taking place here. So he carried those people, the ones that were conquered, he carried them away to Assyria. And then Hoshea, the son of Elah, led a conspiracy against Pekah, the son of Remaliah, and struck him and killed him, and he reigned in his place in the 20th year of Jotham, the son of Uzziah. Now, the rest of the acts of Pekah and all that he did, indeed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles? So here's what we get. This is the beginning, if you will, of now the Assyrians are beginning to work their way into the nation of Israel, and they'll eventually, in the time of Hezekiah, make it as far down even as Jerusalem. The problem is, once the regional powers would start to come onto the ascendancy, in this case it's going to be Judah, but the idea that God's people would ever make alliances with any foreign governments and with any foreign people powers just tells you how bad things have become, because God never wanted them to do that. They have nothing in common with them. So why God would really give a prohibition on going to those other nations is for a couple of reasons. One is that it really tips their hand that there is a weakness that's going on, but then God does not want them involved with people who are not of like mind. They are not God's people, and the corruption is going to come in. Very similar to what we see when Paul tells the Corinthians that they should not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. So the same principle holds true whether Old Testament or New. God wants the Old Testament, the Old Testament tribes to be absolutely reliant upon him and none other. Well, that's long since changed. It's long since gone. It never took root in the north, and this is just a continuation of those problems. So God is beginning to really kind of ramp up the disintegration of what will be the north. And really that was going to be going on all the way up through Jesus' time. That the people up in the north, because of these types of things, were seen as kind of a mixed multitude. They were impure as far as they were concerned. And the people down in Jerusalem, the Pharisees and all the religious leaders, looked at those people in the north as just less than Israel because of mixed breeding, as they saw because of these other nations. And they just saw them as just bad, half-breed kind of people. And they didn't even see their own hypocrisy, but that's another story altogether. It was why they hated Jesus so much, if for no other reason, just from where he was from. Nazareth, that place up in the north, it was really despised. It's that Judah versus Israel mentality all the way into Jesus' time, though Israel had been displaced from the land by the time Jesus rolls around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, roughly 800 years almost. So that gives you an idea, still the kind of animosity that was there between the north and the south. So just kind of interesting little tidbit of history. So in the second year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, Jotham, the son of Uzziah, the king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, did according to all that his father Uzziah had done. However, the high places were not removed. The people still sacrificed, burnt incense on the high places. He built the upper gate of the house of the Lord. So something that, between Solomon's house, the royal dwelling, the royal house, and the temple, wherever it was, and again, there's still a lot of debate on that, by the way, but he did something to enhance what was there. We're not given any details, so there's no sense in jumping into the details of it. However, notice this, the high places were not removed. Now, the rest of the acts, verse 36 of Jotham, all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles? And in the days the Lord began to send Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, against Judah. So here's the problem that starts to arise. Now they're beginning to make political pacts with these other nations to attack one another. This just, again, if you ever want to know the depths of the wickedness and the perversion that had taken place, this is a great indication of it. So what we have here, the king of the north wants to attack the king of the south, so Israel against Judah, and they enlist the king of Syria to help. Okay, so here's what happens. Jotham rested with his fathers, as we get in verse 38. Rested with his fathers, they buried him with his fathers in the city of David, and Ahaz, his son, reigned in his place. Now, Ahaz is going to be a bit of a departure in the south for all the wrong reasons. So Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king. He reigned for 16 years in Jerusalem, did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord his God, as his father David had done. Instead, he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. That gives you an idea by the time. Think about what was going on in Israel and how wicked they had become. It was horrendous what was taking place. So you're going to see here. So indeed, he made his son pass through the fire according to the abominations of the nations who the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel. And you know what this means by the passing through the fire? This means just what it sounds like. He sacrificed his own children on the altar. That, if ever there's a reason for us to understand just how incredibly wicked things had become, this is the indication. Now, more than likely, this was taking place in the valley of Hinnom, or the Hinnom Valley is what it's called, and or the valley of Gehenna. Now, if you've ever seen a picture of the city of Israel in those times, and you can really kind of piece it together from being there now. So if you've ever seen it, or if you've ever been there, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about as I'm about to lay it out before you. If you haven't, go online and just get a picture of the city of Jerusalem. Find one that shows the Temple Mount with the golden dome, and then notice how it goes down, and then it comes to a point as it goes from the south. So what you're seeing, if you look at that golden dome, like up here, it's at a higher elevation. That's the northern part of the old city. And as it runs to the south, it goes downhill. And as it goes to that point, that's the city of David. So as it goes downward into that point, that's the city of David. Here is where the Kidron Valley would be. Here is where the Mount of Olives is. Here, in this direction, is the Hinnom, or the Gehenna, the valley of Gehenna. This is what we know from the history, as we'll be reading it, especially in Chronicles. This is where they would do all of their child sacrifices. And again, remember, this is in Judah. This is not Israel. This is not the north. We were thinking that the south was the better of them. And now with Ahaz, we're seeing that he sacrificed some of his own children in that valley. It's the wickedness is off the charts. It's just so hard for us to reconcile that these are the sons of Jacob, the tribes of Israel, now having kings reigning over them that would sacrifice their own children. So he sacrificed and he burned incense on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree. Now, then Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to make war, and they besieged Ahaz, but they could not overcome him. And at that time, Rezin, the king of Syria, captured Eloth, or that's Elat. So think, if you're looking at Israel, as it comes down from north to south, know where it comes to that point, and it's right here at the Red Sea. I don't know if you can see that. But where Israel comes down here, and there's the Red Sea, down here is Elat. It's a port city, and it's still there to this day. But what happened now, they made their way all the way down to the south. Syria is coming all the way down to the south, and they've taken that port city that belonged to Judah, though Judah is well up to the north. So take a look at it on a map, you get an idea. And when you're looking on a map, if you're looking where Israel comes to a point here at the Dead Sea, go up north and find where Jerusalem is. Actually, to your perspective, Jerusalem's going to be here from Elat. It's going to be a little bit more towards the west. That gives you an idea of how much land space there was. But Syria would be way up here, and the northern tribes of Israel would be here. They come all the way down to a port city. Why is that so important? Clearly, that's a commercial route, and that brings all kinds of things from the south into the north, into Israel. So, or Judah in particular at this point in the history. So, Rezin, the king of Syria, came up to Jerusalem. They weren't able to overcome it, and I'm convinced it's because God knew and had already understood Ahaz was going to be an incredibly wicked person, but he wouldn't let Jerusalem fall into the hands of the north for the very simple case that there were still things far into the future that were going to be of great importance, and God was going to preserve Jerusalem in spite of Ahaz. So, verse 7. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, and said, I am your servant, your son. Come up and save me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel, who rise up against me. So Ahaz took the silver and the gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and he sent them as a present to the king of Assyria. There's so much wrong with this, clearly. But make sure that we understand all of what's going on here. A king of the southern kingdom, Judah, if he was in any way a godly person, would have come before the Lord, as we're going to see Hezekiah will do. When it looks the worst, that person, if he knows what's going on, is going to appeal to the God who created Israel. And they're going to look to him to deliver them. Instead, what this man goes to do is tries to make some kind of a political alliance with the people who will ultimately look to destroy the generation after him. So the idea that these people would be so much at war with one another, the north and the south, they would both go to outside entities, other nations, Syria and Assyria. Assyria is just simply, it sounds like Syria, but it's to the north, or it's a little bit to the north, and then obviously to the from your perspective, to the east. So we think of more Iraq, Babylon, all that area. That's what we're talking about with Assyria. And Syria, as we think of it, is just neighboring above Israel to the north and then to the east a little bit. So take a look at it on a map. You can see where it is. None of this is really much of a mystery. So he basically pays him a bribe. So the king of Assyria heeded him. The king of Assyria went up against Damascus, took it, carried its people captive to Kir, and then killed Rezin. Now, it may very well be that with the riches that he got from Israel, from Judah, I'm sorry, taken from the house of the Lord, was probably how he was able to overcome these other nations. That's, it's an infusion of money that is it's necessary to win wars. But think about how he is strengthening them now. Not just by giving them money from the Lord's house, but then if he's able to overcome Syria, think of how Assyria begins to expand as they conquer a neighboring nation. A strong one at that in times past. So think about how this is just snowballing as bad example after bad example, bad decision after bad decision. And here's the worst of them all, which really puts him in a horrible place as far as God is concerned. So King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, and he saw an altar that was in Damascus. Then and King Ahaz sent to Urijah the priest to the design of the altar, its pattern, according to all of the workmanship. So Urijah the priest built an altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent him from Damascus. So Urijah the priest made it before King Ahaz, and he came before he had come back from Damascus. Think about all that's going on here. A king of Judah. Again, remember, Judah is the name place of where the tribe of Judah came from in Jerusalem, is where they had their headquarters, if you will. So a king from Jerusalem in the land of Judah, the very same tribe that would give birth to the Messiah, he comes from the tribe of Judah. So both Joseph and Mary are from Judah, and they are direct descendants of Judah. And yeah, now here you have a king of the tribe of Judah going to a foreign government, hiring them to help to win a battle, and then when traveling, this king sees an altar and says, I really like this, gives direction to the priest to have one built just like it. The priest doesn't have the wherewithal and the self-awareness to say, not a chance. That is not God's design. This is the temple that Solomon had built. Who are we that we would start to take these kinds of liberties? They're just getting started. So it shows you it's not just a problem with the king. This shows you the depth of the corruption of the priesthood, that they are allowing a king to involve himself in the affairs of the priesthood. Never should this be the case, ever. And the priesthood should have said out of hand, absolutely not. But instead they're complicit. He sends them directions and they build it like he wants it. Again, this goes beyond what is simple compromise. This is outright, total, absolute rebellion and rejection of God in every conceivable way, because the formal ritual and the formal worship of God is going to be eradicated at the hands of Ahaz. And he's going to have the priesthood complicit in it. That's what we're seeing here. So, when the king had come back from Damascus, the king saw the altar. The king approached the altar and he made offerings on it. Now, whether he had the priests do it or whether he did it himself, it doesn't say exactly, but either way, it was done at his direction, which the king should never do. And isn't it an interesting thing that King Uzziah before, who was said to be a good king, he tried to do this just one time of making an offering that was never supposed to be, and God struck him with leprosy. In this case, this man is so unbelievably wicked that it's like, all right, I can't even chastise this man as I did with Uzziah. He's just that wicked. We're going to see he doesn't last. So he burned burnt offerings, verse 13. Verse 14 says, he also brought the bronze altar which was before the Lord from the front of the temple, from between the new altar and the house of the Lord, and he put it on the north side of the new altar. Basically just put it out of the way. This would have been the place where offerings would have been made, and from the time of Solomon, if it was done as it should have been, this would have been a representation of everything that took place in the tabernacle of the wilderness from Moses' time on. So this was an acceptable place. God had had things offered to him, and he showed his approval of it. We find that from when Solomon first dedicated the temple, and this is what had become of it. He goes to Syria, sees what was something, there was something there in Damascus, was so impressed with it. He had one made that was like it. We don't get descriptions of it, but it was an altar that was made to sacrifice to foreign gods, to demons, basically. And he removes the articles that had been for the worship of God and brings in this new altar. And notice what else is so sickening about it. King Ahaz commanded Urijah the priest, saying, on the great new altar, burn the morning burnt offering, and the evening grain offering, the king's burnt sacrifice, and his grain offering, with the burnt offering of all the people of the land, and the grain offering and the drink offerings, and sprinkle all of the blood of the burnt offering and the blood of the sacrifice on the bronze and the bronze altar shall be for me to inquire. Up to that bronze altar part, what you have is a total commingling of all of the idolatry and the paganism of the abominations of the nations around, mixed with the offerings that should have been to the Lord in the very temple of God. So it just shows you how absolutely destitute spiritually the things are. As far as the bronze, the lavers and all those things, he just says, shove them aside and I'll figure out what to do with them later. He just, in one fell swoop, takes out all of the formal places of worship on the outer parts from Solomon's temple, just removes them, shoves them out of the way, and replaces them with pagan ones. It's hard to wrap your mind around this. So thus Urijah the priest did according to all that King Ahaz had commanded. So he was just as wicked because he allowed this and did not put up any rebellion. Was it because he was afraid of the king? Probably. But still, a priest, if he was worth his salt, would have resisted such a wicked thing and then let God be the one who would defend him. But by this time, the corruption was so complete it didn't matter. So King Ahaz cut off all of the panels of the carts and removed the lavers from them, took down the sea from the bronze oxen that were under it, and put it on the pavement of stones. And he removed the Sabbath pavilion which had been built in the temple, removed the king's outer entrance from the house of the Lord on account of the king of Assyria. So outward pressure, first of all, was for that. But the idea that he just begins to absolutely remove all of the vestiges of what had been all the way to that time, from the time of Solomon, of all of the formal worship of God that was going on in the temple at the time. He removes it systematically, piece by piece, and starts to replace it with pagan worship. But it's supposed to be a hybrid, so he can still, play the same game of honoring the Lord because of all of the sacrifices, but everything has been removed that God had approved of in times past. So again, if we make a modern application to this speaks so well of what we see of the corruption that has made its way into the church, that people have taken all kinds of corruption from the world and allowed it to be made into the church. This is why we find the church accepting all of the wickedness of alternate lifestyles and so many of the other things that it puts up with, even supporting things like abortion, although they call it the woman's right to choose. You can see the churches that allow this nonsense. And it is a complete affront to God. It does not reflect a biblical understanding of what God says is right and wrong. It is an absolute rebellion against him. But this was going on in Israel. It is a great illustration of, though people can claim or they can show that they are of a particular group, in this case the children of Israel, other people saying, I attend this, quote, Christian church. What happens in practice, what happens in belief, and what they actually do and their rejection of God is so very similar to what we see in the Old Testament and here in the modern times with the church. How you identify yourself, they would all say, well, we're children of Israel. Okay, you may very well be children of Israel. Look at your actions. You are certainly in rebellion against the God who gave you the land. Well, we've got the same situation here. People would say, well, I belong to the first so-and-so church of whatever and give the church name. But look at the practices happening inside the doors and you'll realize that God is nowhere in that place. And in fact, they are in outright rebellion and they will be judged for it, just as these people were. So we see this. Verse 19, so the rest of the acts of Ahaz and what he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Ahaz rested with his fathers, and he was buried with his fathers in the city of David. Then Hezekiah his son reigned in his place. So he didn't sacrifice all of his kids. Hezekiah is going to be a pivotal character in the history of Israel and does some really amazing things, though not perfect, as we will see. But chapter 17 brings us to what I think is a very important part of Israel's history, so I want to take our time going through this because he's a pretty interesting guy. And this is now when we are going to see the first of the major prophets brought into the narrative. Isaiah is happening at about this time. So that's why I want to make sure we take our time through this, because it's such an important transitional time in the history of Israel, because the Assyrians are going to march their way through the rest of the north. They are going to be taken away captive, and Hezekiah is going to be faced with the Assyrians at the very gates of Jerusalem. And during his time and the ministry of Isaiah the prophet, that's all happening here. So I want to take that on next, and we'll pick that up next week. So went through a lot of information here, but again, it's becoming almost a repetitive thing. The kings of the north are always wicked. Now we've been introduced to an incredibly horrible king in Ahaz. Oddly enough, his son Hezekiah is an interesting character. So if you have any questions on that, continue to please reach out to us through the website. You can go to the Contact Us page. It's at oldpaththeology.net, and we love to hear from you. And if you have any questions on this or our New Testament studies that we do as well, those go up on Thursdays. We would love to hear from you, and feel free to look through the website and the YouTube channel. Again, we have content being put up at least twice a week, Old and New Testament. I've had a lot of things going on for the last few months here, but it's starting to thin out a little bit, and I have a lot of content that I want to put up on the topical side of things. So be patient with me and stay tuned. We have a lot more coming up for you. So we'll see you on Thursday when we continue our study through the book of Ephesians. We get to chapter 2 next week, or this week rather. And so until I see you next, God bless you.